Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this policy briefing on expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit. I'm Lauren Pescatori, and I'm the Director of Tax Credits for Workers and Their Families, or TCWF. We are a nonpartisan communications initiative that works with policymakers and advocates at the state and federal levels to improve tax credits for low-wage workers. And today we're here to talk about the Earned Income Tax Credit, or the EITC. Each year, the EITC helps nearly 26 million working Americans keep more of their income. It's one of the most effective anti-poverty tools we have, lifting about 6 million people, including 3 million children, out of poverty each year, and improving financial stability for millions more. But because the EITC is targeted primarily at workers with children, the credit's currently doing very little for those who aren't claiming children as dependents at tax time. In fact, without qualifying children, workers under the age of 25 or over the age of 65 are excluded from the EITC entirely. Policymakers on both sides of the aisle support expanding the EITC's age limits and improving the credit for childless workers. And states are already leading the way. Just this year, Maryland eliminated its minimum age requirement for its state-level EITC, and California expanded its credit for both younger and older workers. Today, you'll hear from a range of experts about proposed legislation and new research around expanding the EITC for these workers. And in the folders provided for you, you'll find speaker bios and resources from all of our panelists, as well as a report from the Annie E. Casey Foundation that recommends expanding the EITC's age limits as one way to help build opportunity for young parents. And so the good news is I am the least interesting person that you're going to hear from today, and so it is my honor to now turn things over to our wonderful team of panelists to kick off the discussion. We are joined today by Jill Hunter-Williams, who is Deputy Chief of Staff for Congressman Danny K. Davis, who serves on the House Ways and Means Committee and has co-sponsored legislation to increase the EITC for workers without dependent children and expand the credit's age limits. Elaine Maag, a senior research associate in the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where she studies income support programs for low-income families and children. Robin McKinney, co-founder and CEO of the Cash Campaign of Maryland, a nonprofit that improves the financial security of low-income Marylanders, in part by preparing tax returns and providing financial education and coaching free of charge. And Cynthia Miller, an economist and senior fellow at MDRC, where she directs the Paycheck Plus pilot program, testing an expanded EITC for single workers without dependent children in both New York City and Atlanta. And the Paycheck Plus program actually just unveiled brand new findings from that program today. So Cynthia will be talking about some of those with us today. And to moderate the conversation, we're thrilled to have Indivar Dutta-Gupta, co-executive director at the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. Indivar leads work to develop and advance ideas for reducing poverty and economic inequality in the U.S., with particular attention to gender and racial equity. He also serves on the National Academy of Social Insurance's Board of Directors and is a member of the Poverty, Employment, and Self-Sufficiency Network. So we have a great panel discussion ahead of us today, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Indivar and our panelists to kick off the conversation.
Thank you, Lauren, for the introduction. Thank you to Tax Credits for Workers and Their Families and you for arranging this briefing. Thanks also to our terrific panelists for being here today. I'm just going to make 2 points in my introductory remarks. First, that the EITC is both a model policy and one with substantial room for improvement. Second, that the EITC is the core part of a broader strategy for addressing economic inequality and poverty. So the first point, the EITC is simultaneously a model policy and one with substantial room for improvement. What do I mean? As Lauren mentioned, the EITC is widely effective. It shrinks poverty, increases employment and earnings, rewards work, likely improves health, and increases educational achievement and outcomes, especially for children and participant families. We obviously can't say that about every social or economic program. The EITC is generally responsive to changes in need, whether they be demographic or economic. This is a stark contrast to other programs like the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, which is our nation's shrinking welfare program. The EITC is efficient. The administrative costs are about 1% of total benefits paid. This compares quite favorably to other programs that have costs of up to 20% of benefits paid. And it's not just people here in the US who've been impressed by the EITC. Other rich countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, have looked at our EITC and have established very similar tax credits. But even so, the EITC fails millions who are left out, is unusually complicated for participants, and is too meager for many who are eligible. So regardless, Why are we even talking about this? Congress is considering lavish tax cuts for the wealthiest and highest income people in America right now, after already passing nearly $2 trillion in tax cuts over 10 years, precisely along the same lines as what they're considering now. And if anything, indirectly, the EITC was shrunk in the last tax law through a new inflation adjustment. And here we are talking about just a measly $72 billion a year program for workers and their families. And I think that's because, while it may be hard to see it right now, the EITC is and will be a core part of any broader strategy for addressing economic inequality. That's why we're here, and that's why we need to talk about this now. So if we think about the last sort of half century, and you put aside health coverage and subsidies, which arguably the costs of which primarily reflect the extraordinarily high cost of healthcare in the US, after-tax incomes for the lowest 20% or so of households have been roughly flat over the last 40 years, while incomes for the top 1% have roughly doubled. So there are a number of likely factors contributing to this troubling trend, including declining unionization, changes in labor demand, fading employer norms, and demographic factors. And the varied causes argue for a variety of policies that address the specific issues, whether they may be a higher minimum wage, tackling concentrated employer power and anti-competitive behavior, or empowering workers directly. But the diverging trends also suggest that some of us have benefited enormously from the economic growth of the past few decades, and that there's plenty of income in this country to afford boosting incomes for working people who our economy continues to leave behind. Never mind the potential long-term fiscal benefits to spending on the EITC with some of those gains I mentioned, especially for the second generation. So that's where the EITC comes in. Even a perfect EITC won't solve every or even most aspects of poverty or economic inequality, but its virtues mean that we should make sure it does everything it's suited to do as we build a broader agenda for ensuring shared prosperity. So with that, we're going to get started with our panelists. And let me start first with Elaine. So Elaine, why don't you just tell us, how do you describe the EITC to people who don't know anything about it? How does it work? Who benefits? Who doesn't benefit?
So the first thing I always say is something that you and Lauren have both pointed out, is that the Earned Income Tax Credit is the largest anti-poverty program we have in the U.S. for working-age people. The way it works is you start to earn some money, you start to accumulate tax credits. You get larger credits if you have larger families, and you get almost no credit if you have no children. The credit goes ahead and phases in until it reaches its maximum, which for a family of two is about $5,000. And then it starts to phase out once your income is roughly twice poverty. You're no longer getting the EITC. So it's lifting people's incomes directly, but it's doing it mostly at tax time. And what I mean by that is most of the EITC isn't distributed throughout the year. It's distributed when someone files their tax return and claims that credit. The EITC is unique among tax programs in that it's refundable. So that means even if the EITC exceeds your taxes owed, you can receive the remainder as a tax refund. And that will reduce workers with children, their tax liabilities on the federal side, often below zero. So almost all the benefits, 97% of them, go to families with at least one child. The people who don't get the credit really are workers without custodial children. Some of these are people who have children who might not be living with them. Some are older workers. Some are students and younger workers, so there's an age limit if you don't have children that doesn't apply to anyone else. And then importantly, the EITC completely leaves out people who aren't working, and which is to say that the tax system can only go so far as it's set up today, and it doesn't touch people who aren't working.
Great, thank you, Elaine. I'm going to jump to Robin. So your organization helps low-income workers and their families claim the EITC at tax time. Can you talk a little about what you see as the impact on those who participate, who are eligible, and benefit from the EITC, and what does that mean for those who are left out, the folks who Elaine was just identifying?
So we serve 23,000 people across the state of Maryland, which brings back about $33 million in refunds. So it's a large-scale effort. We see the average refund of about $2,000 coming back to those workers. And for many of them, it's the largest paycheck, right, that they're ever going to get over the course of the year. And that lump sum is really what provides opportunity. That's first and last month's, deposit into a new apartment. It might be a car repair. So people are using it pretty immediately. While we do a lot of work to make sure that people try to save for emergencies at tax time, we know that a lot of that is going back into the communities. We talk a lot about, it's not going to the Cayman Islands, right? It's being invested in their local community and pretty immediately on their basic needs. The other thing that we see that's really valuable for folks is that because you can go back 3 years, if you haven't filed taxes for 3 years and you're due a refund, we routinely see people that can get $10,000 plus. And that's an incredible, again, life-altering amount of money. So for us, of course, we tie it with financial education, financial coaching to figure out how they can best maximize that impact. But it really is a life-changing amount of money. A story I wanted to share is from a woman named Diddy who came to us. So she's a worker that does not claim dependents. She is 19 years old, and she's been on her own since she was 15. And so she's always made about $10,000 a year through different odd jobs. And she really wanted to be a phlebotomist and needed $1,500 to go to that school. And to be a phlebotomist, you get the training, and you can get a job near immediately. This isn't like she has to wait for a 4-year degree. And she couldn't come up with $1,500. Had she been eligible for the EITC and something that was more valuable, even if we had gotten her $500, that would have gotten her that much closer to be able to become a phlebotomist and actually have a career that she could do to move forward. And so we heard stories like that many times. One of the reasons why we got so interested in the EITC for workers without dependents is that we noticed that while our number of tax returns was going up, our amount of EITC was getting smaller. And we're like, what's going on? And it turned out that the demographics of our sites were shifting, whereas we had traditionally been workers with children, we were getting increasingly more workers that were single that were not claiming children. Now, this included non-custodial parents, so people that were supporting kids but just couldn't claim them, foster youth transitioning out, younger workers that were on their own. There are lots of people who just don't have family support and are on their own starting at 18. And so with that, we saw a real shift. And so that's when we started to realize how small these refunds. So those are folks increasingly getting left behind because every time in the state of Maryland we increase the EITC, it's always for the folks that have kids and not for the folks that aren't claiming kids.
It's remarkable. Thank you, Robin. So Jill, and I've known Jill for about a decade. She's been fighting this fight for a long time. So I'm excited to hear about the legislation that your boss, Representative Davis, has sponsored to expand the EITC for some of the groups Robin and Elaine mentioned are left behind. So why don't you tell us just about the bill, why it's a priority for your boss, and why it should be a priority for everyone else?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So Congressman Davis is from Illinois, and he has a really long history of championing issues for fathers. Goes back in Illinois, and since the early 2000s, Mr. Davis worked with Senator Obama then and Evan Bayh on his fatherhood bill. And that bill had many elements to help fathers be able to be present and financially contribute to their children. A key piece of that were the EITC expansion provisions for childless workers and non-custodial parents. So this goes way back for us because Mr. Davis's point is if you're going to be present for your kids, a key part of that is being able to contribute financially to them. But many low-income non-custodial parents are barely able to support themselves. Some of the data we were able to see is about a quarter of all non-custodial parents are poor. We see this in the child support program. If you don't have a good paying job, it's very hard to support your kids. Also, a lot of these childless workers and non-custodial parents have many barriers to employment that kind of channel them into lower paying jobs. They're returning citizens, they lack high school diplomas, they don't have college degrees, they have transportation issues. So all of these things are kind of creating a workforce of very low income workers. When we first started the earned income tax expansions, we focused on lowering the age to 21. Right now, to be eligible, it is age 25 to 64. And so Mr. Davis recognized that there were a whole bunch of workers who were not benefiting. And so we lowered it to 21. Most of the bills on the Hill do lower it to 21. A few years ago, we started looking to redo the bill. We were about to reintroduce it, and a whole group of advocates for foster youth came in, and they said, you know, foster youth aren't getting this. And I said, what? Because Mr. Davis is one of the senior Democrats on issues for foster youth. And so we looked at it, and it makes sense. Foster youth, if you're foster youth and you're a parent, boom, you got the EITC. But a lot of foster youth aren't parents. They're not going to college. Actually, the number was, I believe, 20 to 30,000 foster youth between 18 and 21 age out of care annually, and 3/4 are not enrolled in college by 21. That's a whole bunch of foster youth who then are working poor, and we're taxing them into poverty. So they should benefit. So Congressman Davis and Senator Casey lowered the youth for the EITC for foster youth to 18. Well, then we started talking to the apprentices, and the apprentices pointed out, hey, look, we start working really early, and we don't get this either. And then we had like the Job Corps and the job training program, so like Youth Build came to us, and they said, hey, we're not getting it either. And so I asked for some data, and in Youth Build, for people who know that program, the graduates age 18 to 24 are earning jobs paying close to $20,000, and 70% of them are childless workers. In Jobs Corps, which is a premier residential education program for at-risk youth age 16 to 24, the average placement wage in Chicago is below the livable wage. So we've now realized that we have so many young workers who are not benefiting from this really great program. That means they're not establishing their economic well-being, they're not strengthening themselves in the way that we need to so that they can support themselves and their family. And we were thrilled that on our committee, the ranking member, Richie Neal, has a longstanding commitment to earned income tax credit expansion like Mr. Davis. And as you all may have heard, we've been dealing with tax reform lately, and we were so grateful that Mr. Neal worked with Mr. Davis to combine our two proposals as the Democratic amendment to the tax reform bill. So it would expand the earned income tax credit and lower it to 18. So it failed, as it would in the House. We're in the minority. But it was a nice piece to show our commitment moving forward. So the next time we do this bill in the Fatherhood and the 116th, we will be lowering that age to 18. For some of you who came in, I passed out a handout. I'm not going to go through it, but it's really nice to kind of see the different legislative proposals and how they affect things. There are four main levers in the earned income tax credit, and how you tweak those levers is what makes these nice little mountains and colorful charts. So in your leisure time, you can see the lowest little hill, that's current law. So it is leaving out a whole bunch of people. Mr. Davis's bill is the blue bill. Mr. Neal's bill is the red bill. The green one is the Obama FY16. And then the big, big daddy of all, the Black Mountain, is the Senator Brown Ro Khanna bill. They all are going to differ by how quickly, who's eligible, how quickly they get their benefits, how much the benefits are, and how quickly those benefits go away. And that's what the slopes of the different graphs are. The levers that you mainly change are the percent credit the maximum credit for single parents or for childless workers, and this to me is one of the most egregious ones. So single childless workers can only get 7.65% of what the child or the parent workers get. That is not a lot of money, 7.65%. Mr. Neal's bill doubled that rate. Mr. Davis's bill almost triples that rate. And Mr. Brown and Mr. Khanna's bill, like, blows it out of the water. So everybody's recognizing we need to do more there. The bills also differ with how quickly those monies go out. So the higher that percentage rate, so if current law is 7.6%, Mr. Neal's is around 15%, Mr. Davis is 20%, Ro Khanna's is 30%, that's going to make the slope on that left-hand side go up fast, which means you're going to get the money quicker. You also have the phase-out rate, which for those of you in tax world means at what point that amount of money starts to go away. And then you have the phase-out, or the phase-out range and the phase-out rate, which is how quickly it goes down. So when you see the right slope of the line get more people who are higher income, that means you're taking it down slower. So that, and there are pros and cons to each. The benefit of this is that so many people on the Hill value this. That's important. I mean, Mr. Davis loves his bill, but the important thing is that we're all saying something needs to change. And I will, before I close, just point out that a credit similar to the EITC in Great Britain was what they credit was one of the key levers that they help with reducing child poverty by 50% in 10 years. So if you hear those policymakers, the MPs, talk about when they reduced child poverty rate in half in 10 years, when our child poverty rate was increasing, it was largely due to a refundable tax credit similar to the EITC.
Thank you, Jill. Thanks for your leadership on this issue. So I'm going to turn to Cynthia. So this is a particularly fortunate day for everyone to be here. MDRC has been testing an expanded EITC for workers not raising children in a couple big U.S. cities. And I think the findings were released this morning. So what can you tell us? And what can the findings, what do they mean for the sort of policy changes that we're discussing?
Sure, thank you. Just wanted to mention the executive summary was handed out as you came in, and the full report is on our website as of this morning. Let me just give you a little background on the program. As everyone's mentioned, under the federal credit, if you don't have kids in the house, the maximum you can get is just over $500, and it phases out once you reach $15,000. So a full-time worker, full year at $8 per hour is ineligible for any credit. And as Elaine has mentioned, I believe in other writings, if you have 2 kids, you're a single worker with 2 kids, the maximum credit you can get is $5,600. That's 10 times more than what you can get if you don't have any kids. So what Paycheck Plus does is try to bring that up a little bit. The maximum benefit is, it's actually in the middle of all of these proposals that were handed out. It's a maximum benefit of $2,000, phases in at 30%, and you get the maximum benefit of $2,000 until your earnings reach $18,000, and then it starts to phase out, and then you're ineligible once your earnings reach about $30,000. So we launched the study with the help of and funding from the New York City Mayor's Office of Economic Opportunity in 2013. We worked with Food Bank for New York City to recruit 6,000 people into the study, and you had to be single, no plans to claim dependents when you filed, earned less than $30,000 in the prior year, and 21 to 64. So we did also lower the age a bit from 25. Half of those people were assigned to the program group eligible for the Paycheck Plus bonus when they filed taxes in 2015 and for 3 years. And the other half were not. So what we did is we followed them over time and compared the program and control group. It's an experimental comparison, so any differences are due to the program. So I just want to mention the diversity of the sample. 40% of them were women. Half of them were over age 35. A lot of, a fair number of people had adult kids who were no longer living with them. 25% of them had at least some college credits or higher level of education. 1 in 5 had been incarcerated in the past, and 10% were non-custodial parents. So it's a very diverse sample, reflects a range of circumstances. So the main findings, we followed them for 3 years and used IRS data to capture earnings and employment. The first main fact is that people had more money. Among those who claimed the bonus in each of the 3 years, the average amount they got was about $1,400. If you think of that as a percent of your earnings, that's about an 8 or 9% increase of their annual earnings. Not everyone got a bonus in every year, and I can talk more about that later if we have time. But in a randomized control trial, the valid estimate is comparing the entire program group to the entire control group. So if we look at that, and that's what we report in the report, is that the program increased what we're calling after bonus earnings, or basically take-home pay. So it's earnings plus credits minus any taxes. If you compare the program group and the control group, it increased that amount by 5 to 6%. So that's a little bit less than the percent I just mentioned earlier, because not everyone in the program group got a bonus. The second main effect is that the program reduced severe poverty. We used survey data to look at family income in 2016. If you looked at the control group, about a third of them had income that placed them in severe poverty, meaning their income was below 50% of the poverty line. The program, if you compare the program and control group, we reduced that by 3.4 percentage points, so by a 10% reduction. Now, other research on the EITC for families with kids has found that it's reduced poverty quite a bit. Where our findings differ is that we don't see a big, at least for the full sample, we don't see a big increase of pushing people above the official poverty line, but we're reducing the severity of it. So we're moving people from below 50% to above 50%. And that's partly explained by the fact that the bonus amount, as you can see from the figure, is lower. It kicks in at lower income levels. The next key effect is that the program brought more people into work. It increased employment rates by just about 2 percentage points in 2015 and 2016. The first year technically is 2014, but that's before anyone got a bonus, so we weren't really expecting large effects at that point because people didn't really trust the program or believe that it was real at that point. So the second and third year effects that we're seeing, we think are a better measure of the real effects. We also looked at effects on employment rates for different types of study participants. We found that the effects on work were larger for women than for men, but they were also larger for a subset of men that we called more disadvantaged men compared with other men in the study, and this group was defined as those who were previously incarcerated or non-custodial fathers. And each of these groups faces their own particular barriers or disincentives in the labor market, and if you follow them over time compared with other men, they have much lower employment rates over the study follow-up period. So we found that for this particular group, the effects on employment grew over time, and by the third year, the program had increased their employment rates by 6 percentage points, so that's about a 10% increase. And there were pretty large increases in earnings for this group, but they weren't statistically significant at conventional levels. So this is kind of an exciting, encouraging finding, because this is a group of a great interest in trying to find policies that can pull more of these men into the labor market. The final key fact is that the program increased child support payments among non-custodial parents. We used state child support records and found that non-custodial parents in the program group were about 11% more likely to make payments in 2015 and 2016, and this makes sense because the program increased their take-home earnings and their employment rates as well. So I want to mention a couple of other things, but I can come back to them if you want the key findings. Should I go?
Go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to put these in context. The findings on employment are in line with other research from economics about how responsive people's employment rates are to the payoff to work. So in other words, if you look at this literature and then you consider the parameters of Paycheck Plus, that literature would say, well, we would expect anywhere from a no increase in employment to a 7 to 8% increase in employment. So our effects are completely within that. That research also shows that women tend to be more responsive to men, and that's also what we're finding. However, having said that, we think the effects might be bigger if this were to become national policy and part of the tax code, and for a few reasons. So the first is related to eligibility dynamics. In the federal EITC, most people don't get it continually for year after year. They dip in and out as needed. And, their earnings increase and they become ineligible. And then, they're replaced by newly eligible workers. So take-up rates are pretty consistent over time. The same thing happened with our sample. It's a fixed sample. People entered the program eligible, and by the third year, they were earning too much. They were ineligible, and maybe they weren't working. But we didn't have new people coming into the study. It was a fixed sample, so the result is that our eligibility rates fell over time, and so did bonus take-up. So we think the effects would be bigger if it were policy, because new people would be always coming in over time. The second reason is that bonus receipt in this demonstration was not automatic when you file taxes, as it would be if it were a federal policy. You had to file at a VITA, a participating volunteer income tax assistance site. If you didn't, you had to bring evidence that you filed into one of those VITA sites and then prove that you filed and sign how you wanted to get your deposit. So it involves several extra steps. The final reason is that it's a demonstration, and people, this happens in any program you test, is that people forgot about it over time. Every tax season, we would send them, multiple postcards, mails, robocalls, emails, texts to remind them, hey, you're eligible for this bonus, come in and file. But, some people would write back and say, oh, I thought it was just for 1 year, or, they just, forgot about the program. And that, again, wouldn't happen if this were national policy. So I think that makes us think that the effects would be larger. We're also testing it, as you mentioned, in Atlanta. We'll have interim findings for the first 2 years available next year.
Great, that's really helpful context. Cynthia, thanks for your research on this. And we'll have time for questions at the end. I'm just going to run through sort of one more round. Elaine, I don't think anyone has sort of analyzed improvements in and alternatives to the EITC as much as you have over the last sort of decade plus. So in particular, you've looked a lot about expanding the EITC's age limits. So can you tell us a little about that, how that would work? What are some of the options on the table? I know Jill gave us a sense of some of the legislative proposals. Who would benefit? What would it cost?
Right, so one of the things the Tax Policy Center likes to do is enter new parameters for tax policies, run the model and see how much they cost and who benefits. So we've done a number of experiments over time, and it turns out that tinkering with the childless EITC age limits is pretty cheap in tax world. Part of that is because most tax policy programs are really big. We just had a $1.5 trillion piece of legislation. But if I would just lower the age of eligibility by 1 year, it's about $100 million. So this is just small potatoes in the tax world. It's almost rounding error at CBO. If I increased the ages by a little bit, it's even cheaper because there's so few older workers, but I think those older people who are still working and low income are in a precarious position, and it's worth thinking about them. And I'll also mention that we have, with the EITC, some investment income safeguards. So if you are a typical older person and you get a little bit of earnings and most of your income is coming from investments, you wouldn't be eligible for the EITC because you'd sort of look kind of like a rich person with all this investment income. So we did this experiment where we said drop the age down to 21, and at the top, let that age float with the maximum Social Security full retirement age, because that's increasing over time. And for $3.6 billion, and that's a 10-year number, I can cover all those people with the EITC. So it's a small group of people that has specific needs. We did another experiment, though, because as other people have pointed out, it's not just that the credit amount is low for these workers without children at home, it's that it covers such a compact income range. So where families with children can get up to like twice poverty, you're like out of business if you are even poverty, if you don't have children. And so if I did a program where I made the childless EITC look about like the one-child EITC, that's $95 billion over 10 years. So again, it's a little bit big in the context of social welfare programs, but it's like pennies in the tax world. So tax writers should feel very comfortable proposing this type of legislation.
Great. The best $1 billion you can spend, I think. So thank you, Elaine. Let me come back to Jill. You mentioned and put in context your Representative Davis's proposal. It's not the most ambitious out there, but it's pretty ambitious. And we already had one run at tax law changes, and there was no improvement, obviously, in the EITC. Is there a possibility of bipartisan support here? What's the path forward for improving the EITC in Congress?
Oh, my crystal ball. I have no idea. The EITC is historically a very bipartisan proposal that was advanced. The biggest jumps in the EITC over time came from conservative Republicans. So I believe that there is theoretically interest on both sides. I think some of the groups that are being left out are of interest to both sides. So I believe as we move forward, I'm hoping for a better environment at some point. So I think we can return to that bipartisanship. I don't know when. I'll keep my fingers crossed. But maybe in fits and starts or pieces of it with a foot in the door.
Thank you, Jill. I'm going to come back to Robin. We know there's been a lot of support for some of these expansions at the state level. California obviously expanded the EITC to include younger workers down to age 18 and also older ones, 65 and older. And thanks in part to your leadership, Maryland has eliminated the minimum age requirement just this year. So why was this a priority? For you, you sort of told us why for your organization, but how did you make it a priority for lawmakers?
So every year we talk about EITC with lawmakers because tax season comes every single year and you never know what your moment is going to be. And so what often has happened in previous times that we've raised the EITC is they were raising the sales tax or doing something to the state tax, and there was an understanding and really a value that if we're doing something that could either negatively impact folks on the lower end or that we're doing something to really help higher income folks, that this is a balance. And so we appreciate that value. However, it's a lot easier for legislation to just do a percentage, right? Maryland piggybacks onto the federal. So it was, raising it from 20% to 25% and then from 25 to 28 over 4 years. That was a weird one because half percentage a year. But what we found is, again, once we figured out that these workers were being left behind, the first thing we did is say, well, what are our options? We looked at these 3 levers, basically. We looked at age, we looked at income, and we looked at the value of the credit. And we felt like to really do right by this group that has been left behind, this group that's in Maryland is actually being taxed into poverty. What is their best case scenario? And then we knew that we would sort of be able to slice and dice based on what the legislative interest is. And I will say immediately people got it. People were very, sort of pro EITC and didn't realize that there was this issue around age. We immediately wanted to go to 18. I think we do a lot of work with foster youth, and so we felt like that was a good age. But we ended up actually just eliminating the minimum age with the understanding that there's a small but really vulnerable group of folks that are emancipated minors. And so these are folks, and so that's why we just eliminated the age instead of lowering it to 18. Again, a small group of people, but we felt were particularly vulnerable. I would say the age is, we were asked pretty early on, which slice of the pie do you want first? And we always said age because we just felt like that's just righting a wrong, right? That's just the whole reason that it was set at 25 was, what I would describe as a middle-class understanding that people are being supported through college and after by their parents, and that's just not reality for many Americans. So the first was just, let's just write that disparity because it's just not true. And what we found actually is, we were able to get different promises of different amounts of money, and we could have gotten more, honestly. And this is where scoring becomes really important. So in the end, we were able to pass a bill that's going to help 40,000 workers by eliminating this age requirement. That's great. That's awesome. We appreciate it. It costs like $5 million. The budget that we'd been given was 20 to 30 million. And so because of the way things were analyzed, they thought they just didn't sort of take into account what we thought that they should take into account. And so we could have actually gotten more. We could have gotten more pieces. And I think that's why it's so important as we're thinking about the analysis and the research that goes into this, is because these three pieces, each of them are so important, but how much do they cost standalone? And then how much do they cost together? That analysis is just really critical. So we will be back, because I feel like I left $20 million on the table, for about 440,000 workers, which would almost double the program in the state of Maryland. So we have a lot of work to do on that. And the thing I wanted to highlight, too, that I think is really important for Congress to think about is that so many of these states, their state EITCs are piggybacked, just like Maryland is. And so with the federal, with the tax law changes, we had to decouple a lot. And so now more and more states are decoupling, so we had to now on our EITC, and that just makes it a lot more burdensome for taxpayers to try to figure out, okay, well, what do I need to do at the state level and at the federal level? It actually makes the tax code a lot more complex. So if we could have this more, uniform expansion at the federal level, that would make what we do at the state level a lot easier to implement.
Thank you. So just one last question, then we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience. And I'm going to start with Cynthia, but others can jump in after briefly. So we've got these trends, arguably over the last couple of decades, of some growth in deep poverty among households with children, potentially extreme poverty. And we have a lump sum payment here we're talking about. And you mentioned, obviously, that Paycheck Plus did actually improve sort of reduce the depth of poverty for some folks. But how important is it to think about how to adjust the payment mechanism and change the EITC in ways that reach some of those folks with the lowest income and earnings? Or how much should we rely instead on other policies and measures for that?
That's a good question. I'll just say from my experience, I think the EITC it could be much more generous, and it's a hugely effective anti-poverty policy. It doesn't work if you don't work, though, and so it's only one part of a well-functioning safety net. I think for families with kids, maybe there are things with a child tax credit or a child allowance that could be considered. I think the first step with the EITC, though, is just to increase the generosity of it.
Perfect. Anyone else want to jump in?
I was going to say, the value, to me, the intersection of the income expansion, age expansion, and value of the credit, each of those, they really do work together. And when we ask people, what would you do with an extra $500? Because really that's all we're talking about, versus a couple $1,000s. And people were still doing things that were life-changing to them. $500 is still life-changing, which is great. And we know that it could be that much more. So I do think that we need to we choose one slice at a time and go with it, but it might mean moving increments on each to make it most powerful.
So I think if I were going to spend a little bit more money in the ITC, I would focus on these workers without custodial children. But there's also a change I would think about in the context of what you're talking about. Without spending any more money, we could think about distributing it differently. So we've done research at the Urban Institute that shows that 40% of people have an income jump of 25% above or below their average income, and that number is closer to 2/3 if you're low income. So we know people's incomes are bouncing around throughout the year, and then they get their EITC, and in some cases, families are getting 40% of their annual income in one lump sum. And while those lump sums are important, what I worry about is that we're making people non-poor in March when we send a tax credit out, and then we're dropping them right back into poverty for the rest of the year. So I think there needs to be some thinking done on how do we distribute some of the EITC as this important lump sum investment type vehicle, and how do we distribute some of it as an income support vehicle throughout the year. And I think now that we have a little bit of experience handing out premium tax credits, although those are quite different because they're going to insurers instead of people, that we can try to use those lessons and figure out how we can do this for people as well. When Pew did some research, they asked people, would you rather have a higher income or would you rather have a more reliable income? And low-income families will often say, I would like a reliable income.
I just want to jump in here a little bit. I agree with all three comments. The Great Britain tax credit is on a regular basis. And I remember when they told me that, I was like, how do you do it? Because we failed miserably when we tried something over here. So as much as I would love to do it via tax, it's important for people who aren't as familiar with the IRS and the tax is that they have very antiquated systems. So for me to tell you that the IRS really can't do this right now, just trust me on that one. I mean, so any idea of doing this within the tax code would have to be married with a fundamental overhaul of the ability of the technology of the IRS. But I absolutely think it's important, but don't just say, oh, the IRS can do it, because they can't.
Thank you. Questions? We have 10 minutes. We'll go just a couple minutes over. Okay. Questions? Please, yeah, just let us stand up, let us know who you are, and there's a mic coming around right behind you, actually. I'm not sure it's turned on, is it? Yep.
Hi, my name is Alexander Afrani. I work in Senator Kane's office. And I just wanted to have two questions. Historically, have you seen many people, when they get an EITC, go above in terms of income and then come back to reclaim the EITC over a few years? And secondly, in your work with foster youth, how are you seeing with apprenticeships in the Job Corps that the barrier is these lump sums, or the $1,500 you mentioned earlier, that EITC can help them get into these programs? Is that something that you've worked with?
Great. Okay. Start. Robin, start us, and then Cynthia. She wants
So I think the first thing is that we see absolutely that when people can get a lump sum, that they're able to access some of these different programs, because sometimes there might be, especially for foster youth, there's a lot of like tuition waivers and other things that they can do to get into a program, but they still have to like live, right? So they still have, a place to stay, they might have food, they might have transportation, and despite all the other benefits you can get around as a foster youth, there's often a gap. Also, every state has a different cutoff for foster youth benefits. So in Maryland, it's 21, but in some states it's 18. So that's a big gap too. Every state is different in what they're able to offer. And what was the other part of the question? The first part.
Time.
Oh, over time, are they coming in and out? Yeah, so in Maryland, the average person that gets the EITC, it's something like 70% of the claimants get it for 3 years and then move on. And so we're seeing more of an upward trajectory. There are certainly people that dip in and out, especially as we see more with the gig economy, right? And people sort of having, income that's a lot more volatile or inconsistent. But I would say we see the bulk of the people get it for 3 years, it gets them to the place that they're not eligible for, and then they're launched. And that's exactly what we want to see. I would say the thing that I hear people invest in it besides basic needs the most is transportation, because that transportation gets them to the better job.
One thing I'd just like to add, when we're talking about foster youth, one of the things that's also come up for us when you're trying to debate these types of policies is if you do have a full-time student, do you exclude them? So some of the policies actually exclude full-time students. Mr. Davis chose not to, because our perspective is if you're a full-time foster youth and no one else is taking care of you and you're all on your own and you're working to survive, yeah, you need it. But that is something to keep in mind with certain populations who still might be in school, might not be working full-time.
So I would just add, I think that full-time exclusion is really, like, it should be gone. This is a provision that the IRS has great difficulty administering, and so you don't want to pile on more provisions that make it difficult. But to your question about overtime, on the federal side, the IRS put out some great research a few years ago. About a third of the people claim the EITC just once, a third of claimants do it 2 or 3 years, and then a third of them are sort of long-term. But people are coming on and off the EITC for 2 reasons. The first is that their incomes are changing, right? So some of them get a better job and move. But the second one that's perhaps more important is that families are changing. So people are coupling, and the IRS cares about, you know, the income from both partners if you're married. And children are moving in and out of homes. So more and more children are spending some time with one parent and some time in another home with another parent. And it's the parent where the children are living the majority of the year that's going to be eligible in that particular year.
Thank you. More questions, please, in red.
Hi, Joanna Ain from Prosperity Now. Would love to circle back to the idea of folks receiving the EITC more than once a year. In July, bipartisan group introduced the Refund to Rainy Day Savings Act. So this would allow a household to opt in and defer 20% of their tax refund for 6 months. If you all could speak to that and that idea, thinking about how to help families access this big chunk of money more than once a year.
Thanks. Elaine?
So in principle, I think it's a really nice idea that you would allow a mechanism to essentially save money. And particularly for communities that have a lot of unbanked people, it's not such a bad deal to have the IRS hold your money for 20% of your money for, 6 months, because you're probably not going to find a better deal on the private market. So you're going to get some, level of interest. The flip is, if we asked high-income peoples, would you mind if I just kept a share of your refund for 6 months? They would be on fire. And so I think we have to be really sensitive to thinking through not just providing a mechanism to save the money, but also an incentive to do so that would make it more worth people's loss of that income.
One thing I wanted to share of how we see it work on the ground is that we have the federal EITC, then we're lucky to have a state EITC, but we also have one of our counties has a county level EITC in Montgomery County. And so the layering and sort of timing of that, people are getting their state and federal within a short period of time, but then their county level EITC comes in July. And that's just because of when the data matching and everything is sort of cleared out. And so they call it basically like Christmas in July in Montgomery County, which is not holiday inclusive. It's just what they say. So, so that amount of money, we have a paper we did with Center for American Progress on this, of sort of like looking at how these if you have an additional EITC, could you tier when that comes in a way that gives you that income boost, but doesn't get into the mechanisms of the IRS and otherwise. So just something that we see on the ground of how those things can layer.
Great, thank you, Robin. More questions, please? It's going around.
My question is around, and Jill did, I wondered why the EITC had more than 40% you used to get during the year. And I should know that the IRS could manage to have money like that. Because that was really helpful to a lot of the families that we serve. But my other question is that we still have families who face losing other benefits when they try to save for benefits. And what can we do around that?
So there are federal provisions that your earned income tax credit refund is not counted in benefits eligibility. And I think that makes a lot of sense to people. It's just an extension of the transfer system run through the tax system. But you're right, then there's this catch. If you save it, you can get kicked out of eligibility. So what we can do is we could legislate it differently. We could just raise those limits on how much you can have in the bank. Some of them are quite low. SSI, right, it hasn't changed since it forever. They're very low. So I think we have to make some transfer side changes that allow people to have more savings and sort of recognize that if the goal is to move people off of assistance in a permanent way, you're going to need to let them get enough money to be able to step off to do that. So, someone else mentioned first and last month's rent, an automobile to get to and from work, child care, right? Like these are all things that are very expensive and you're going to have to save for them. And we're going to just have to design our transfer programs to allow people to save for those items.
Probably you want to add Jill first and then.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think we did eliminate some of the savings barriers for the ABLE accounts. We've tried to do this in SSI for foster youth and had no luck bipartisanly. So I am not terribly confident in a wide-scale ability to do that. But I do think it's important to keep raising it and showing it, the importance to people. And data, I think, at the state level will be very helpful.
So we eliminated asset limits in Maryland in 2010. Hooray for us. Getting it to make sure that that is fully implemented is a daily and weekly challenge to make sure that people still understand that. And really the way that we were able to get that done, and we did that through regulation, not through legislation, was actually to create a budget and show how far $2,000 does not go for these families. And I think a lot of the legislators on both sides of the aisle understood the sort of general financial planning advice of having 3 months of your expenses and savings, right? Well, by what we were showing, we used something called the Maryland minimum living level, which is what our benefits are calculated off of, is people couldn't even save 1 month. On those asset limits. And so, and they had to spend them down within 60 days. And having those figures, which are also, that Maryland living level is so low that no one actually could live at it, which is a separate issue. That was really helpful for people to see that, like, here's the budget, and especially bringing in how much full-time work pays. And I think that's a good intersection with the EITC to say you could be working full-time at the minimum wage and still not getting the gap. So I think that data can be really helpful to overcome that. But on the implementation side, it's been 8 years, and there's still plenty of people in Maryland, caseworkers, who have no idea and are still testing for assets. Yeah.
Maybe a last question. You had your hand up earlier in blue. Yeah. You still have a question?
Hi, my name is Steve. I was wondering, so currently I believe that 24 states have a earned income tax credit similar to the federal level. Would it be more politically viable to have Congress encourage the other states to develop their own instead of, a massive federal overhaul?
I mean, I would just say on that decoupling issue, it's the heartburn that our local revenue administrators felt when we first brought this idea before tax reform happened, right? They're thinking about what's the investment in their technology that they need to do to decouple. Again, right now, like, all of our bills were increased to 25%. They go in, highlight a number, change it, and the system goes. When you're talking about decoupling, it's a much bigger programming shift. And what happens for people, so for example, in Maryland, this is a really fluid area, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, Pennsylvania, DC. We often have people that are part-year residents or that work in and live in different places. So we routinely see tax returns from all of those different places within one worker. And so I think the more it's on the state, then again, it just puts a lot more complication on the tax preparer to figure it out. Those ones that aren't registered by the IRS because they lost the ability to do so, except for VITA, free tax prep volunteers that are tested every year. So I think that creates a lot of challenges.
You want to add anything? Well, let's thank our panelists.